Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who despite the odds managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history, from makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies. Their story is one, and determination, so before you get comfortable, take a of grit, ingenuity, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what a moment to like the video, and what time it is for you. Hit as always do here, and let me know in the comments where you're re-tuning in from. Fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting, knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about how do we not die tonight. It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this: you're living in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered, pathetically doing its best, but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry. You might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose down blankets. You had a couple of rough spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion spoiler. Didn't really work, and forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure, and bonersome fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort, it was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure, it was just beginning. If you think you're the cold wind found every crack, apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly. Medieval peasants would like a word there. Homes were unto never got to just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians looked picturesque, sure, politely call will and dauber. Construction translation stick, crisscrossed like a giant basket smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky, right off the wall mid-blizzard to make matters worse. Insulator, plus it was always readily available. Shall we say these walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. So technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it in winter. Every gap and gleefully danced its way into the one-room home, swirling around and making sure comfortable privacy. Absolutely not warmth. Not really character building, definitely. And then there were the roofs, thatched roofs, but after a few months of rain and snow they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says. Because if your house was falling apart and goat hair, well, pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane, and peasants, they were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhut. Were often just compacted dirt when it rained or snowed heavily. Mud seeped up when insulted through the ground every step inside. Your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh, cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They know that cold was relentless. It seeped up during a winter night. Congratulations. It was now part of the. Some homes layered dried rushes, packed gaps with moss-jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest, creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only thing standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. And your best protection against the elements involved mother wet dog. At least you could laugh about it, sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard as if the freezing air wasn't enough. Medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then, they were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home maybe. If you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping back away from the cold hard dirt, from the earth, like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones, and straight into your very soul if you dropped anything onto the floor. Permafrost medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor if you could afford it, or more realistically if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught. You might have a decent insulating barrier, but straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights onto the dirt. Instead, every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones over time. This created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding if your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like beds. For those who had them didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning was you went about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero, during winter it was on the roof, or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. Was the hearth a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life? At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No. Instead, you had a basic pit or fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimneys sweeping the smoke skyward. Pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimney smoke, just kind of did. It's best it drifted out through small holes in if it was feeling lazy that evening. Was unideal for the roof cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs and other unwanted guests who needs pest control when sat around the fire telling stories, breathing, or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of was-unders fumigating fleas, you re-marinating in smoke. 247 The hearth wasn't just about warmth. Either it was the kitchen, the lighter precious piece of dry wood. It was a source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People gossiping or just staring into the flames because frankly there was much else to do. After sunset, keeping the fire in the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you alive wasn't just a nice idea. It was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter, easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty stoking the flames, watching the embers. It could be deadly matches, adding peat sticks, or if you were lucky, constant battle between human persistence out the hearth. Didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight without that warm, flickering lifeline. The cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. So peasants got smart. They, and in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch was just inconvenient, didn't exist yet. Lighters dream on rekindling a fire, a little add fresh wood and voya fire without the embers tight. Others meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. love, and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine some said use dry ash. Basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat in the end. Fire banking. Trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now yes, it happened that's why some families took turns getting up in the had a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. And if you woke up to banked the fire, no, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash. Right. Before bed, the ash acted like a blanket, was one surefire source of warmth, each other, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive just barely until morning. If of the house wrapped, you did it right. You could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile, frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. And if cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better method that slowly flattened under the nightly. Was the ancient version. Sometimes banking the fire was under enough a howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or you got to sleep in the middle where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were on the outside of the group like human shields, clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Wasn't just about survival though. Over time it became part and more night to check the coals was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. Even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties, it was a winter survival tactic. When they would like to introduce you to their winter fire sputtered, and the freezing winds whistled through every crack there, and if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept on the coldest nights. The goal wasn't comfort, it was don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner and cows lounged luxuriously at night. The house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens in whatever scraps of cloth they could find and formed what could best be described as a desperate snoring. Human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the butt. Medieval peasants developed a trip with someone who forgot to shower, matching out a layers for one. More, if you were lucky. Unlucky, you were on the edge. The medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker, and woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable and suddenly you've knocked into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations. You're now the family with livestock, villains. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it was on the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated and death in medieval like the precious little heat generators. They were this of daily life, part of family bonding, long winter nights huddled together. Two storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you not fighting skin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat, or old rags, and stuff them into wooden clogs. If the youthful modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants, housemates, cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for and in survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated HVL where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was interestingly the dirt and grease. Slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky stone nested in corners. Pigs snorted near the hearth against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road, we're often homemade from whatever that, but it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells legendary by springtime, the perfume of a shared winter, was something than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled over fierce. You didn't need to light a candle, your nostrils were already on a wild ride, was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy was on to sinew. So the next time you complain about layering up, Selective knows they didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots, cows being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near. The family goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway, chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor, of course, sharing your bedroom. Wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs. Peasants understood the simple math: cold kills, and cows cuddle whether they want to or not in the battle. Against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life. Winter's fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends, they were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple: if you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic under tunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another. If you had it, add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched up sheep approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth, cold still bit through. Well, you just added another rag and hoped he didn't lose a toe, and forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Build-up had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable. Today, hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves, scraps of leather or fabric people could scourge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes. Stuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. For a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like laundry bags, and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off it. Given up on life, it was tactical, strategic. Dare we say genius? See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in, as peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing. Layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't into plush featherbeds with quilts. Think. Again, the reality was a bit failure. It was fashion, it was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer, February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough peasant spent their winters tucked, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw hay or old rushes that it no more rustic, and by rustic I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best beds. The night brought a delightful soundtrack off some peasants. Wooden frame, memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of attracted bugs and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big barnyard, and regret every toss and turn-in was spread thick on the floor, sometimes crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious groundal sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy. Event usually done a few times a year if you were diligent or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses, mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor, livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy and optimism. You quickly learn that winter breezes are just a nuisance, almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks, and trust me, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows, fleas with lice and other charming critters loved straw bedding more than you slept. Congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval and sometimes even animal hair if experience. Despite the hot, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, must be nice. Because in a way it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. You'll live in a house made of sticks, mud, but even then they were little, and snow peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in their personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes. There were a lot of cracks, walls warped, mud, crumbled thatch sagged the cold, yet somehow in sheer stubbornness window holes were often seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist, patched, stuffed and muddled their way through the worst winters. Grudge sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straws, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass. It was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating. It was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls do extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in up under freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain. No late-night snacks, and so someone had to be on ember patrol. And since no one wanted to get up, moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field, every then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, while trying not to home. Eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows, if you had them, you were lucky. More than wood planks hung by iron nails, covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of yet. Despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Mystery meat to the living space every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless. Or next time you grumble, and when it was sneaky cold, one minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks. Through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being medieval peasants' nature could throw at them. One muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody wanted hard enough to keep you awake at night. Medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy. Today, like they just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and would make any military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by infirm prayers. So easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. Once there were finally warmish families, rotated shifts, you dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake. Step on a goat. The rotation was unglamorous. There were no night vision goggles, certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze. Trying grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. Your turn to sleep. Good luck with people moving about, animals, rustling wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over to hard. Getting quality rest was a miracle. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension so did the family. About waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 o'clock a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs in a world where pneumonia could kill. To take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air, most importantly through the nose, the idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea. People even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, morning, but hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early.